I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, ongoing discussion of the wisdom or folly of President Donald Trump's pulling the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or simply the JCPOA. As we discussed in our first In the News regarding this issue, for anyone looking for intelligent, objective information with which one can formulate one's own opinion to support or oppose the president's action, the highly charged partisan climate in which we now live, where people who detest Donald Trump are so blinded by their hatred of the president, they have lost all credibility when it comes to their criticisms of any Trump administration policy. Many Jews want Trump removed from office today, and they're unable to give the president any credit at all for any good he may do, including his recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There are rabbis who in general believe U.S. recognition of Jerusalem is way overdue, yet they oppose Donald Trump's moving the embassy to Jerusalem because it is Donald Trump doing the moving. The fallout from this deeply partisan divide in our country today extends to the mainstream media, much of which is on a self-righteous crusade to remove the president from office, which has cost the media not only some honor of responsible journalism, but credibility when it comes to reporting on issues, which is why it's so important, vitally important, to find those who look at the issues of the day and bring critical thinking to bear on those issues, who can offer a rational, well-thought-out assessment of a policy's strength and weakness. And one of the clearest thinkers on the American scene today is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and columnist who now writes for the New York Times and serves as a senior political commentator for NBC, Bret Stephens. Bret, it's wonderful to speak with you again.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mark.
Thank you. Bret, you occupy a very unique position in the world of American journalism. On the one hand, for many years you wrote for the Wall Street Journal and were considered to be on the right, but you were unequivocal in your vocal opposition to Donald Trump's campaign to become president of the United States. You are hardly seen as a fan of the president. And yet, you wrote a fascinating piece in the Times in which you seem to give the president credit for pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Bret, where do you stand on America's withdrawal, and do you support the president's decision?
Well, I think the title of my column in today's Times says it all. It's called A Courageous Trump Call on a Lousy Iran Deal. It's true I'm known as a never Trump conservative, but I have, when the president has taken actions that I agree with, for example, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, maintaining U.S. troops in Afghanistan, appointing Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, I have written in support. I try to call them as I see them, and I think my job is not just to be a partisan hack, but to sort of try to think clearly and objectively about different decisions and different moments in this presidency, while also trying to maintain a moral center, if you will. So I think the president made the right call. I'd argued vociferously, if I may say, against the deal back in 2014, 2015, when it was being negotiated.
You sure did.
And it would have been intellectually inconsistent and feckless for me to now turn around and disagree with Trump's decision just because it was Trump making the decision. I think the deal was dangerous for the United States, dangerous for the Middle East, dangerous for Israel, dangerous actually for the Iranian people. And this now creates a possibility of reaching much better policy and a much better deal. But so long as we were tied to an agreement which would eventually give Iran a pathway to a nuclear breakout, we were on a dangerous road. So I'm glad he did this, and I'm happy I can make my case to the readers of the New York Times.
Well, you make it brilliantly, and it's interesting. While your headline talks about the courage of Donald Trump, and this is not meant to embarrass you, Bret, you have been courageous, and you've taken courageous stands time and time again when you were with the Wall Street Journal, when you were with the New York Times, and I am in awe of you, and I always love it when you give me some time, and so I thank you for that. Kol hakavod. I want to ask you to answer the criticisms of Donald Trump that those who just think this is the worst thing he could possibly have done, this is their reasoning. They begin by saying, the deal is working. In essence, Iran is not trying to get a nuclear weapon, and although Benjamin Netanyahu showed us 100,000 documents indicating that it was, it was something Iran wanted to do, he showed nothing to us that Iran has been doing it. And therefore, why would Donald Trump walk away from a deal that was working? What's your answer?
Well, a couple points are worth making. Number one, the Iran nuclear deal was based on a lie, and that's the import of Benjamin Netanyahu's disclosure of that remarkable Israeli intelligence coup. Tens of thousands of pages of documents pilfered from under the noses of Iran's nuclear masters, which, assuming it's all credible, and I have no reason not to assume it is, demonstrates that Iran was duplicitous and dishonest when it signed on to the nuclear deal. One of the conditions of the deal, one of the conditions for the relief of sanctions, was that Iran had to make a full disclosure of its past nuclear work. It didn't matter whether we already thought we knew what they had been doing in the past. It was up to the Iranians themselves to come clean, and they didn't do that. So that alone should render the deal null and void, because the Iranians didn't meet an essential precondition, whether or not they fulfilled the terms since then. Now, as for the argument that the Iranians have been relatively scrupulous, and actually not entirely scrupulous, but relatively scrupulous in sticking to the broad terms of the deal, well, of course they have, because the deal is in their interest. Mm-hmm. What we basically said to Iran is, we will relieve many of the sanctions on your economy now. You will be able, in a decade or so's time, to restart your nuclear program with a fundamentally hollow promise that they won't actually develop nuclear weapons, but will have all the capability of getting at least very close. And in the meantime, you can continue to pursue terrorist and disruptive activity throughout the Middle East and the entire world. And I think that was crazy. I mean, one of the points that is important for listeners of this show to remember, Mark, is that the economy of Iran is about the size of the economy of Boston. Okay, we're not dealing with a 10-foot-tall giant. And even now, with Iran having had sanctions relief, it's still experiencing massive devaluation of its economy, and it's still experiencing massive capital flight. So the suggestion that this was the best deal we could have reached against an opponent that is this weak seems to me just farcical. I think we're in a good position to force Iran to irreversibly and verifiably abandon its nuclear programs and stop supporting terrorism, and we should expect nothing less.
Okay. You're taking the position, again, this is being opposed in many media organs, television, print, radio. The argument is there's nowhere to go now, that Trump has walked away from the only deal that had been possible, that the European allies remain in the deal, and that ultimately nothing can be done to improve it. In your mind, Bret, what can the Trump administration and the United States as a leader do to improve what you described so beautifully as a failed deal to begin with? But what can be done?
Well, in the weeks preceding Trump's decision on Tuesday to walk away from the agreement, all of a sudden these European leaders who had been busy insisting that the deal, as flawed as it might have been, was the best possible deal we could have ever reached, suddenly were becoming very creative in coming up with new ideas for how to improve it. And I find that, the moment you stop to think about that, it's the best deal we can possibly have, but hey, we've got some great suggestions for making it better
Yes.
without actually walking away.
Yes.
And these involved, so right there, they're giving the lie to their own claims about the agreement. Their idea was that the United States and Europe make a variety of side deals to increase sanctions and penalties on Iran for its regional misbehavior and, in particular, for its testing of ballistic missiles. But that was a very faulty argument. One of the things that was so peculiarly bad about the Iran nuclear deal is that it actually weakened UN restrictions on Iran's right to test ballistic missiles, which are, of course, a critical component of any robust nuclear weapons program, as we've been learning in the last year from North Korea. So you can't turn that around unless you get a UN Security Council resolution, and the Chinese and the Russians are going to back Iran anyway. Or take the subject of Iran's regional misbehavior. Well, we have freed up billions of dollars for Iran to continue to fund its terrorism in Yemen. You saw the Houthi rebels appear to have fired Scud missiles once again at Riyadh, for Hezbollah, for its own forces in Syria, which may be on the verge of war with Israel on the Golan Heights. So we are feeding the very beast that the Europeans now claim they intend to fight. Why not just stop feeding it? So the deal was faulty at its core. You now have an Iranian economy that is experiencing labor disruptions, severe unhappiness, as you saw back in January with those massive protests, that so much Iranian money is going to fund activity in Syria, terrorism in Syria, as opposed to relief of the Iranian economy. You have a combustible situation in Iran, and we have a possibility to put the Iranian regime to a fundamental choice. We can say to them, look, you can have your nuclear ambitions, and if you want to pursue them, it's going to end in ruin, in economic ruin and potential war for you guys. Or you can have a path to a functioning economy, but in order to achieve that, we need real disarmament, not the fakery that was sold to us, or the stalling that was sold to us with Obama's nuclear deal.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Bret, what about the claim that the president has undermined American credibility by walking away from a commitment made by his predecessors? Many media pundits are claiming the president has done damage to U.S. relationships with our Western allies, and that he's created a problem for himself in trying to get a deal in North Korea, because people are saying, well, he walked away from Iran. How can North Korea believe he won't walk away, or the next president won't walk away from any deal that Donald Trump works out there?
I think low on my list of priorities is worrying whether North Korea thinks we're a credible negotiating partner. It's us who should be worried about North Korea's credibility as we gear up for this forthcoming summit. Look, I think it's a bit of a laughable claim. One of the reasons why the founders wanted to have a high bar for the ratification of treaties, 2/3 of the Senate had to approve a treaty in order for it to become law, is that they understood that if our relationships with other countries were going to be credible and consistent, you had to have treaties that would last from one administration to the next. That's why you wanted that big 2/3 majority. What Obama did is, knowing that he could never submit the Iran deal to Congress as a treaty, he essentially created a political fiction, a political undertaking, in his name only. Even the Obama administration admitted this was not even an executive agreement. It was never even signed. The JCPOA, the Iran deal, was never even signed. So, if you build on sand, you're going to get washed away eventually. Mm-hmm. And when people say, well, this is, the question of America's credibility at stake, the Iran deal was widely opposed by a bipartisan majority of the Senate and of the House of Representatives. It was wildly unpopular when it was shoved through by means of a Democratic filibuster. And I would say to the people making that case, if you really believe this is such a terrific agreement, why didn't you spend more time persuading the American people of its effectiveness and getting it passed as a treaty or even by a simple majority of the Senate, rather than ramming it down the throats of a rightly skeptical public and then turning around and insisting that American credibility is at stake? The credibility that's really in question was the credibility of the Obama administration, which couldn't even sell its own deal to the American people.
What about Israel? How does Israel factor into this, do you think? Was Israel and Netanyahu in any way an influence on the president's decision, do you believe, to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I suspect, look, Donald Trump was calling this, the worst deal ever, or whatever the exact words he used, long before Netanyahu made his presentation last week. I have no doubt that Netanyahu had a strong influence on the president's thinking, and the disclosure of Iranian shenanigans and of their cheating last week probably was, the proverbial nail in the coffin. So this is a victory for Netanyahu, but I think this is more of a case of two national leaders thinking alike,
yes,
rather than the wagging the tail wagging the dog. Bibi has been fighting for this for many years, but really the heavy lifting is to come, because the question is, now that we're out of the deal, how are we going to go about getting a new one, and what is Iran going to get up to, perhaps including starting a war with Israel as a way of creating a crisis in order to extract better terms from the West.
Are you worried about a war now, Bret?
Yes, I've been worried for some time. I was in Israel over Passover. I went up to the Golan Heights. At the time, the border was quite calm. But the day I was up there was the same day that Bashar Assad once again gassed his own people in a suburb of Damascus, just 40 or 50 miles away. I think you clearly have Israel on high alert. That's an open secret now. People preparing safe rooms in case of a missile attack. You saw what happened on Monday night or Tuesday morning with the Israeli strike on what appeared to be an Iranian installation, possibly about to attack Israel. And if the Iranians are going to attack Israel directly using missiles, that's not a small retaliation. That's a major step to which Israel would be obliged to respond in a very big way. And I fear that Israel and Iran, as well as its proxies, may be on the cusp of the biggest war we've seen in the Middle East in decades.
Will it be worth it? There are those who argue. There are those who argue that
it would be worth it if Israel. Look, war is never worth it. Let's say that. But in a sense, this is the important sense. It will be worth it if it deals a decisive blow to Iran and its terrorist proxies, Hezbollah, that have not only brought fear to northern Israel, but brought so much misery to the people of Lebanon and Syria. What I hope we don't have is a reprise of the 2006 war, where Israel waged war from the air only and did not achieve a strategic result against Hezbollah, and therefore just helped create some of the conditions which have led to all the suffering we've seen now in the last 7 years since the Syrian civil war began.
Bret, I receive emails all the time from people who hear you when you speak on JBS and others, and I received an email from a very respected liberal Jew, a leader in the Jewish community, who said to me that the Israel and the Jewish world will rue the day the president moved the embassy to Jerusalem and walked away from the Iran deal. And the implication of the email to me was that if there are Jews who are supporting the president's actions here, while it may feel good at the moment because it seems to be a pro-Israel move, ultimately it's going to bring more pain and more sorrow, and that ultimately it will implode upon itself. If you were to have received such an email, how would you have responded?
I guess I would say, time will tell. But, what I think, Jews would have rued the day, once again, sleptwalked into a future where Iran could enrich as much uranium, would have the legal right to enrich as much uranium to as high a level of purity as they would like, because we thought that buying a few years' time was worth the price. This is an argument that's only going to be settled by history, and it's going to be settled by what takes place in the weeks and months ahead in terms of U.S. policy making. But I think we've created, at least by walking away from this deal, the possibility of a far more creative strategy and diplomacy in the Middle East that is going to put pressure on Israel's most serious and deadly strategic adversary. And perhaps we've also created conditions that will finally force the Palestinians to recognize that they have to negotiate in good faith and not instead of trying to go around Israel at the UN and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So I would just take a different view. Look, you have to be intellectually humble in this business. When you're a columnist, you write 2 columns a week. That's to say you're making 100 sort of big calls on a variety of subjects every single year. And it would be arrogant and foolish to claim that I'm right 100% of the time. What I try to do is bring some experience and independent judgment to bear on these questions. I've been writing about Iran, reporting about Iran, and reporting on the Middle East for close to 20 years now. I was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and I think I'm bringing my best judgment that walking away from the Iran deal is the smart thing to do, the smart play, and moving the embassy to Jerusalem is simply right from a historic, legislative, and frankly moral standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said, Bret. All right, before I lose you, I want you to talk to me about some of the things you've seen in the last 30 days as it applies to the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. We just heard Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas just say some horrible things about Jews, and that they brought the Holocaust upon themselves because of their own social behavior and financial conduct. It wasn't about anti-Semitism. And we've seen this conflict along the Gaza border where Hamas has whipped up Palestinians that try to want to break through the fence. As you look at the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic at the moment, how do you assess where it's going and world reaction to it?
Well, I think, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, sort of said it very well when he basically said that the world is getting bored of the Palestinians because it doesn't seem that they're really serious. If the Palestinians are interested in building a state, they should stop building tunnels under the border in Gaza. If they're interested in building a state, they should stop using their own people as propaganda tools and human shields to try to break through the fence. If they're interested in building a state, they should finally evict Mahmoud Abbas, who's now serving, I believe, he's in his 13th or 14th year of his elected 4-year term of office. If they're interested in building a state, maybe they should start studying what the Jews of the Yishuv period were doing in order to create the foundations of a viable, democratic, liberal, tolerant, progressive, technologically advanced, and economically competent state. And I think that's where that's in a sense where things stand. You know, unfortunately, we have learned both by what Hamas is doing in Gaza and by what Abbas said in his speech the other day, that even now Israel doesn't have a seriously viable, a morally viable partner that's prepared to make the kinds of long-term historical concessions needed to bring his own people along and to persuade his own people that their future would be much better served in a small but functioning state, a place like Costa Rica, than in some kind of imaginary dream palace where they are thinking of themselves as a kind of a 21st century version of Saladin, expelling the so-called foreign invaders from their land. They've got their history wrong, and I think they've got their predictions wrong. You know, the Palestinian politics, which is, you know, we're coming up on what they call Nakba Day, has been a politics of 70 years of rejectionism and therefore failure. And I would hope that at some point it would start dawning on a majority of Palestinians that some of this failure is a function of constant militancy against their Jewish neighbors, a function of constant terrorism against the Jewish state. That's not how you go about building a state. It's not how the Tamils in Sri Lanka didn't gain a state that way when they resorted to terrorism. It's a very foolish gambit, and unless they start thinking of other methods, unless they start getting seriously involved in the work of state building, that is, building their own state, rather than state destroying the states, I should say, of their neighbors, plural, not just Israel, but it's their other neighbors. They're never going to get what they claim to seek. And I think that may be a lesson of the last 30 days. I think we may see a lot of activity coming up to May 14th, May 15th, and I hope that there isn't a major loss of life, and I hope that something crystallizes in the Palestinian mind that they can't keep going on like this. Israel is not going away. Israel is prospering as it never has before. Its economy is booming. Its relationship with Arab countries is stronger than it's ever been, not to mention places like India and Japan and the United States and many countries in Africa. Someone has to yank them into a more 21st century way of thinking. And a policy of sort of endless grievance and violence is not the ticket to a successful future.
You are just fabulous. And you know, I watch you on American television sometimes. I get so angry they only give you 3 minutes. I love the fact that you come on here and have the opportunity to really talk to our audience about your perspective and share the way you view the world. And you're doing just the most wonderful work, Bret. And the fact that you are kind enough to be on JBS from time to time is so sweet of you and means the world to me. I hope you and your family have a wonderful summer. And at some time, we'll talk again soon.
Thanks a lot, Mark. All the best.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bret Stephens, who now writes his column in the New York Times, and I don't think there is a more brilliant analyst commenting on world events and issues that affect not only the United States, but the state of Israel, and really issues around the world. Bret Stephens. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, our production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, and of course to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.